Which free agents on the offensive side of the ball can help Zach Wilson develop and get the Jets back to the playoffs? Michael Nania of JetsXFactor.com joins me to discuss this on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast for Thursday, February 17th, 2022. I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. This podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Our motto is your team every day. No matter which team you support in pro or college sports, there's a Locked On podcast that produces new episodes each day, Monday through Friday. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. That includes YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, click the subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube and like what you see, give this episode a thumbs up. It will help other Jets fans find this channel. Today, Michael Nania of JetsXFactor.com, a good friend to the podcast, joins us. We're going to talk about free agents on the offensive side of the ball who can help out the Jets. Let's jump into my conversation with Michael, and I will warn you if you're watching on YouTube, we had a few technical issues when we recorded this podcast, so you will only get the audio on YouTube. But it's a great discussion, lots of great insight from Michael. He's one of the best Jets writers out there, and I look forward to chatting with him. Joining us today is Michael Nania, a good friend of the podcast. Michael does a lot of great work over at JetsXFactor.com. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
Today we're going to talk about free agency, and we're going to focus on the offensive side of the ball. Before we began recording, Michael and I were chatting, and we realized that most of the focus is on the draft right now for Jets fans, but free agency comes first, and it's going to be very important as the Jets look to rebuild their team. So let's begin at quarterback. And the action here is all about Zach Wilson's backup. We know Zach Wilson's going to be back as the starting quarterback in 2022. The focus of free agency is going to be finding him a backup. And Michael, I only have one request. Please, 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 no more Joe Flacco. Listen, a lot of respect for him. Won a Super Bowl in Baltimore, tremendous career, but it's over. Just whatever you do, I'll be fine with. No more Joe Flacco as the backup quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think he can still be a good backup in the league, but just for us, from an entertainment perspective, I think I'm done with that for now, forever actually. But I think just bringing back Mike White is the way to go at backup. I mean, obviously the whole body of work he showed you wasn't great because he went out and had the Buffalo game with the 4 picks. So the overall, he's not the answer as a starting quarterback for anybody, but as a backup, the fact that he came in and did what he did against the Bengals is more than you could ever dream of from your backup quarterback. So just to see that capability, it looked like against the Colts, he was on the path to a good game. So he's a restricted free agent. I think they could put the original round tender on him and just bring him back. He's got the familiarity running for a few years now. So I think just bringing back Mike White is probably the most sensible way to go about that.
And I just want to make it clear that I'm taking 100% of the credit for Mike White's success in that game against Cincinnati because I was telling everybody who would listen. I saw him at training camp. He was awful this year. I was saying, this guy can't play. If he ever has to play a snap for the Jets, they're in big trouble.
I agree. I probably said similar things. I was not impressed when I saw him when I went to practice, and even in preseason. So that came out of nowhere.
Now, I do have some concern about bringing White back. I think there's logic to it, but I worry a bit that the coaching staff doesn't really believe in him, and I say that from the standpoint that they made the trade for Flacco immediately after Zach Wilson went down, and then they put Flacco in the lineup for that game against Miami instead of White. And it's one thing to put Zach Wilson back, and he's the starting quarterback, but it seemed like they went out of their way to not play White, and I wonder whether this coaching staff really believes in him, and that could impact the decision.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, they definitely... because as good as the Mike White game was, I think it was overrated in the sense that he didn't really do much. Like he played well, but to get to 405 yards, that was, Michael Carter, Ty Johnson, guys just making plays. And then, like you said, they make the trade for Flacco, throw him out there against Miami when White was already started the last 3 games. So I think that is something to consider. It'll be interesting to see if they go elsewhere at the quarterback position. I think bringing back White is what they will do, but I think your point is a good one.
And the thing is, there aren't really any good options in free agency because anybody who is a viable starting quarterback probably doesn't hit free agency. They get re-signed by their own team. So I think the options are limited if you look for a backup for Zach Wilson.
Right. Exactly. And you're not going to, and that's the biggest thing with backups at any position. You kind of have to avoid having the bar too high. There's definitely a spectrum. Some teams have better backups than others, but backups are backups for a reason. You're not going to find a guy who is a great backup or else he'd be starting. So it is important to keep your expectations in check when looking for depth at any position. But I think ultimately they'll bring back Mike White and roll with him as their QB2. But we'll see what happens.
Let me put you on the spot. Is there anybody else out there who would intrigue you at the least who's going to be a free agent at quarterback?
I mean, in terms of names who would be intriguing for the Jets, I don't think so. I mean, I know a few of the names that are out there, but I just remember looking at them being like, no, Jets wouldn't sign him. Jets wouldn't sign him. I haven't gotten that much of a great knowledge of it because I've kind of just been dead set and bringing back White as the backup. So honestly, to respond to your on-the-spot question, no one else intrigues me. So, but I could be wrong.
No, I can tell you you're not wrong. If you look through the names, you will have the exact same opinion. This is just not a very good group of quarterbacks hitting free agency this year. Now let's move on to the running back position, and I think the pretty clear goal there is to find somebody to pair with Michael Carter. And this could be done through the draft, but let's talk about some of the free agent options who could intrigue the Jets. Any names come to mind for you?
I think one that comes to mind is Raheem Mostert. I mean, he hasn't put up the best numbers since those Niners days when he was, rose to prominence. But a guy who knows the scheme, I think he offers the home run ability that the Jets don't really have because as much as I like Carter, I think the one thing you're not going to get with him is, that top end speed, that ability to hit like an 80-yard run every now and then. We saw him have some breakthrough runs, but he did, he could get the 30-40, but we saw a couple times where, he'd get caught up to a couple yards before the goal line, which is okay because he's still great at so many other things. But I think they could use that home run hitter. So he's someone that comes to mind. Other than that, I like there are some names in the draft in the later rounds that I think they could target to supplement that room. But I like Raheem Mostert. I think he's a pretty good option.
Yeah, and I agree this is a position where they could look to the draft. You have to remember, they got Michael Carter in the 4th round last year. And I'm not saying you can necessarily count on getting a Michael Carter caliber running back every single year in the draft at that position, but I think running back gives you better odds a little bit later on in the draft, especially with the scheme the Jets run, than you get at practically any other position.
Right, yeah. And like you said, you're not always going to hit to a Michael Carter level. I mean, the year before they drafted the Michael Pirine in the 4th round, and he's nowhere near what Michael Carter is. So it's not always going to hit, but it's definitely a position that feels like it has a higher hit rate in those later rounds than many other positions do. And I think a big reason for that is the running back career arc, more so than most other positions, is very just downhill straight from the rookie year. They start at their peak right away and go down from there. Whereas other positions kind of have their development curve for the first couple of years, hit their peak in their prime, 25, 26, 27, 28, and then go down from there. But running backs, it's the opposite. You draft them, get the value out of them, and then move on. So I think that really plays into late round running backs being valuable. And it seems like the Jets understand that, the way that they value the position recently. So I could see another late round running back pick this year to supplement Michael Carter. And if they do sign a free agent, it'll probably be, a lower tier sort of player. I think bringing back Tevin Coleman makes sense. So I think that it seems like the Jets are going to continue valuing this position at a low level in terms of the investments that they put into it.
Yeah, I think when you're talking running back, it probably is one of the easiest positions to transition to from college to the NFL, and that's why you see guys peak so early. At other positions, there's much more technique that needs to be learned. At receiver, you got to learn releases. You have to refine your route running. On the offensive line, there's footwork. Listen, there are some technical things running backs have to do, and there are some things you have to pick up when you enter the NFL. There are lots of running backs who struggle with pass protection. That's something that keeps young running backs on the bench. But on some level at the running back position, you can either do it or you can't, because really it's about, can you make a play with the ball in your hands? And that's something that's kind of intuitive. And if you can't do it early in your career, you're probably not going to learn how to do it later in your career.
Yeah, I agree. And, there's definitely to a point, there's a learning curve, but I think, like you said, it's more natural ability than any other position. There's less, adapting to the league than there has to be in most other positions. Obviously, quarterback's the most extreme example of where you need that development. But every single other position, like you said, the nuance of running routes at receiver, learning coverages on defense, and even playing D line, just the step up in the competition you have to face going up against NFL O linemen compared to college O linemen. So there a lot of positions have that growth curve, but at running back, it's still the same old goal: just read your blocks, make a man miss. So there's less of that development curve. So I think that's why it's a position you could feel confident in not needing the most premium talent to get the job done, especially if you invest in the O line as much as the Jets have. If it can be as good as they hope it can, that's what their goal is, to make the O line the strength of this offense, and you don't necessarily need that top end running back talent to run the ball effectively. So it seems like they're on a good path with this position.
And before we move on to the guys who are going to be catching passes from Zach Wilson, I just want to say I agree with you. I would love to see Tevin Coleman back as the number 3 back. The way I see it is, you got Michael Carter, maybe you can get another young back to pair with him. Make the third back a veteran. And Tevin Coleman's very reliable. He knows what he's doing in the passing game, both in terms of protection and as a receiver. Listen, he doesn't have the blazing speed that was his trademark in Atlanta, but he still got enough to produce. I thought he had a very good season for the Jets. I'm not saying you bring him back as the number 1 back or the number 2 back, but I think as the number 3 back, he's a very good fit for this offense.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing about Tevin Coleman this season, in terms of the way the Jets used him, I think it was interesting that they really relied on Ty Johnson to be that third down guy instead of Tevin Coleman. Because a big reason I was appealed when they signed him is he was always very good in the passing game as a receiver, on screens. Even his blocking was decent. And Ty Johnson, that's the worst aspect of his game. He's a bad blocker and drops a lot of passes. He actually dropped more passes than any other running back in the league this year. But they kept using him on third down, which is puzzling. And I think that is the role Tevin Coleman can fill. I think his size is useful as a blocker. He's good in the passing game, like I said. So I think he can fill that role pretty well. But overall, like you said, I think he played well for them in spurts. He wasn't a huge home run hitter, didn't necessarily make a ton of guys miss, but he got the ball, got downhill, and got a lot of chunk gains, like 5, 6, 7 yards. Not necessarily on average per carry, but it felt like he got a lot of those, healthy pickups to set them up for favorable down distance. So I would definitely bring back Tevin Coleman.
Football is over, but we're hoping the Jets have a big offseason and that they enter 2022 with good odds to make the playoffs. You should also know that basketball is in full steam right now for both pro and college hoops. And from all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired coach is going to land, BetOnline.net is your number 1 spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your best source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds, right to Olympic coverage and information. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Now let's move to the wide receiver position, a very important position for Zach Wilson's development, and I think the Jets would be well advised to try and seek out a big-time receiver to bring in either through free agency or the trade to help with Zach's development. But before we get to that, I have a little bit of a hot take that I'd like to share. And I know this is going to be very controversial, but I don't think Corey Davis was as bad as people made him out to be. Now, I'm not saying he had a great season, obviously some injuries, obviously some drops, but I think he was a perfectly credible receiver when he was in there, and the perception was he was this enormous bust who just should not be part of the team going forward. I don't see that at all. I think Corey Davis is very solid.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I actually did an article on this a few weeks ago, but it really was just, and obviously it's the most important part of receiver, so it's not something to be written off, but it really was just the drops for him this year. And they were bad. He had some bad ones. One of them led to a pick against New England, the one that went straight through his hands in that crossing route. There's that contested catch he didn't make against Denver and great throw by Wilson. So he wasn't, the hands were bad and they weren't what we were used to seeing in Tennessee when he had really good hands. He made contested catches, didn't drop a lot of balls. So that was bad. But even through those, he still made a lot of big plays from the bomb against Tennessee. He had a few other big catches in that game as well. The touchdown he had against New England was great. He carried the offense against Carolina in week 1 with the 2 touchdowns, had a couple other big plays in that game as well. So, he had some really bad moments, but he also made a lot of good plays that kind of got overlooked because of those bad moments. So it just feels like he's got to get his hands back to that regular level where he was before this year. And if he does that, he'll be the guy they signed him to be, which is not necessarily number 1, but, borderline number 1, number 2, reliable guy. He still averaged over 50 yards a game, had 4 touchdowns in half a season, even with all those drops. So if he can just get the drop rate back to his previous career average, which was above average in terms of avoiding drops, then I think his production is going to be right where you want it to be. So he definitely wasn't a major bust. It was disappointing that he dropped so many more balls than he used to throughout the rest of his career, and he has to fix that. But he still made a lot of great plays, and he was separating. He was creating opportunities. He's just got to haul the pass in like he used to.
So for me at the wide receiver position this offseason, the objective should be to swing for the fences. You got Davis back. You got Elijah Moore. I'm not sure you have the go-to guy, though. I'm not sure you have that legitimate number 1 receiver. And listen, maybe Elijah Moore can grow into that, and that would be great if he could. But I really want to get somebody out there who's going to be a go-to guy. And beyond that, even if Elijah Moore grows into the role, I think the objective has to be put as much talent around Zach Wilson as possible to help him develop.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's the biggest goal with this receiver position is to get that go-to guy. Because I think you look at it, it's not the weakest group in the world. I think if you're high on Corey Davis like you and I are, if you're high on Elijah Moore like I know I am, it's there are teams with a worse duo than that. But it's about doing the absolute best you can to support your franchise quarterback and not settling for, we're okay here. Let's do the absolute best we can do to make sure he can be successful. So I think that is a primary goal. Can you get your Stephon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins, that guy to really push your quarterback over the top? So I think that's a primary goal. They do have some talent here. Elijah Moore could be that number 1 guy. I think he has that talent, but there should be no half measures. You got to do whatever you can to maximize your quarterback's odds of developing.
Now, do you think this is done in free agency, or this year do you think the trade market could be a more viable place to find that kind of guy?
Yeah, I think it really depends on, I think, a couple of things. First of all, how aggressive do they want to be? Because I feel like Davante Adams is going to be available. So there was a rumor of $30 million per year, which I think is kind of outrageous. But, he is Davante Adams. Do they want to make that sort of play for him? Chris Godwin's going to be out there. I think he is that type of player. I think the trade market is probably more realistic. A Calvin Ridley trade, Amari Cooper trade, something like that. But also, if they don't make that big play, I could see one of the 2 first-round picks used on a receiver. But there are a decent amount of options. It just depends on how aggressive they want to be, because you might have to give out an outrageous contract to Davante Adams, to Godwin, or make an expensive trade for Calvin Ridley, Cooper, whoever it is. If you want that sort of guy, Michael Thomas is another one. So it depends on how aggressive they're willing to be, and I do think they should be, but there's still a bar you shouldn't cross. Like I said, $30 million for Davante Adams was that one rumor that surfaced a few weeks ago. That's a little bit much, but it'll be interesting to see if how far they're willing to go to get that guy.
I gotta say, I'm not sure I'm out on Davante Adams at a huge price. DeAndre Hopkins is making over $27 million a year. That might just be where the market is for a truly elite receiver. I'd have to think about it. I'm not saying I'd definitely do it. Maybe there are some more cost-effective options, but maybe this is my second hot take. I'm not sure I'm out on Davante Adams at a huge price.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think I could do it just because of I think he's going to be 30 this year. I believe this year he's going to be 30, but he is up there. And there is also sort of a sign that he's great, but the Packers did do really well without him when he didn't play. Rodgers continued to play well. So is he that caliber of receiver? But I hear you, though. Like, that is a lot of money, but we're talking about doing everything you can for your quarterback. That's exactly that. That's absolutely going in, all in for your quarterback, doing everything you can. So I wouldn't be mad at it. But I think that number is a little bit rich for me. Like maybe 25, 27, I would do. 30 is pretty high for me personally. But I hear where you're coming from.
I think like the answer to that is maybe if there weren't so many other good options, which you just named, because there are a lot of other high-end receivers we're expected to be available who maybe aren't quite as good, but almost as good and will come a lot cheaper.
Yeah, so there are a lot of options, and I think it wouldn't be, I wouldn't say it would be disappointing if they didn't get one because there are so many variables. Other teams are going to be pursuing these free agents. Other teams are going to be pursuing these trade targets. A free agent doesn't always want to play for your team, especially when you're a 4-win team. So you can't control everything, but there should be at least concerted effort to make a big upgrade at wide receiver and give Zach Wilson the best supporting cast he can possibly get.
Let's move to the tight end position. As Chris Berman once famously said, so New York becomes tight end after one infamous Jets draft pick at the position. We know it's an important position in Mike LaFleur's offense. We also know, shall we say, the tight end position was not one of strength for the New York Jets in the year 2021. You look at the free agent class, and there's not a great player. I'm not sure there's a complete player out there, but there are a lot of viable options to upgrade, and I guess it kind of depends on what skill set you want.
Yeah, I think the tight end class all starts with probably my favorite free agent target for the Jets, Dalton Schultz from the Cowboys. I think he really checks a lot of boxes for them. I think he's really the perfect guy. I think they need an inline tight end who can block, but also go out and be a threat as a receiver. I think he can do that for them really well. And that brings me to the other big name in the tight end market, who I don't think is a fit for them, and that's Mike Gesicki, who is a very talented player, has similar numbers to Schultz. But for me, and looking at the scheme that the Jets run, what they want out of this position, I feel like Gesicki doesn't really fit what they want to do. He's basically a slot receiver. I think he only ran 6% of his snaps last year were as an inline tight end. So I don't think he's quite the player they'd be looking for. So I think Dalton Schultz is the primary guy they should go after. And I think he is worthy of. The Eagles gave Dallas Goedert a contract that kind of set the market last year. I forgot what the exact number was, but it was well into the 8-figure mark. So I'd be comfortable going there for Dalton Schultz because I think it's really important in this offense. They want to run 12 personnel. They want to feature the tight ends. They want to be able to have their skill position blockers be strong in the run game. Dalton Schultz can do that. He's a good blocker. And in the receiving game, it's not just the box score stats. He's a low drop rate. He's a high contested catch rate. He breaks a lot of tackles with the ball in his hands. He does a lot of things well that are transferable and controlled by his own ability rather than scheme. So I really like Dalton Schultz. And there are some good fallback options. CJ Uzama, Gerald Everett. I think David Njoku had an improved season this past year. Max Williams, if they want a blocker. So there is depth if they don't get Dalton Schultz. If they're just looking for, a tight end 2 or a couple guys who could run, help them run 12. But Dalton Schultz is the guy for me.
I've been going back and forth on Dalton Schultz myself, and part of it is probably my own bias at the tight end position because I dream of the Jets having this athletic matchup nightmare who keeps opposing defensive coordinators up at night, trying to figure out how they're going to stop them. But the more I think about it, the more I feel like maybe Schultz is the right guy for the Jets because, first of all, you need a blocker in Mike LaFleur's offense, but he's also a useful receiver, even if he's not a game breaker. I do have some reservations about him because we're talking potentially over $10 million a year for a guy who's an okay receiver, but not a big-time guy. But slowly I'm talking myself into it, I feel like.
Yeah, and the price it's going to be hefty. Spot Track is estimating him at 12.6 million. Dallas Goedert for Philly was got over 14 million. So I mean, he could even be up around that number. So it's going to be a lot, but I think it does make sense just because of how important I think, because we saw early in the season that the Jets ran a lot of 12 personnel. They were way up there on the. I think they're running it the third most through before the bye week. So they had their tight ends out there a lot. They wanted to use them, but they just didn't have the talent to do it. So then Michael Flores switched it up, played more 11 personnel, but they want it to be a focal point in this offense. And I think uh, talking about ways, we were talking about with the receivers, how aggressive do you want to be to help your quarterback? I think this is a great place to do it. And at a position that can help in more ways than one, blocking, not just in the run game, but pass protection, because that was a huge issue with the tight ends. They gave up a lot of pressure this past season. So I think Dalton Schultz checks a lot of boxes. It's going to be a lot of money for a player who's not Travis Kelce or George Kittle or that kind of tight end, but I think he does a lot of things well and is a really good fit. So going to be interesting to see if they're willing to go to that number for the tight end position, which is something you could work around if you don't have, like we saw them do this year, but also something that I think is for Michael Flores, his vision for this offense is very important.
Yeah, like I've been saying, I've been going back and forth on this. Part of me is just not going to love the price tag for Dalton Schultz, but I guess I can learn to live with it. I guess I can learn to not hate it. Another option out there who might not be a number one tight end, but perhaps an option as tight end two if the Jets are going to run a lot of 12 personnel, Mo Alley Cox from the Colts. Good blocker who I think has some untapped potential as a receiver.
Yeah, Mo Alley Cox is a good one. And a few other guys I like in terms of fallback options. I mentioned a couple of them, but Dave Njoku did have an improved season this year in terms of he didn't put up the biggest numbers in total, but he got his drops way down. That was a big problem for him the first 3 years, first few years of his career. So he showed that solid tight end two ability this season, and I think he's a guy who they could fall back on, not necessarily be their first tight end, but potentially number two to someone they draft. And I mentioned Max Williams from the Cardinals. He's pretty consistently regarded as one of the best blockers in the league at the tight end position, and he's a pretty decent receiver who doesn't drop a lot of balls, can make some guys miss. So either of them I think would be good solid fallback options. Mo Alley Cox as well, CJ Uzama. So it's a deep tight end group, even if it doesn't have only has really Schultz and Gesicki at the top, and other than that, there isn't really a tight end one kind of guy, but there is a lot of depth.
All right, let's move to the offensive line, and I think a lot of the focus there is going to be on the right guard position because you've got Connor McGovern, who I thought had a very good year at center. You have Elijah Vera Tucker at left guard. We'll see what we get from Mekhi Becton at the one tackle position. George Fant coming off a good year at the other one. And I think we all know that through the season, the biggest weakness was the right guard position. Would you agree that that's probably, if there's a focus on free agency on the line, that's where it would be?
Yeah, the offensive line in general is going to be so interesting this season, this offseason, because they have a lot of pieces in place, but just the maneuverability of it, like which positions they're going to attack, both between free agency and the draft, is going to be interesting because we have a left tackle competition. To find out in the Senior Bowl that you're going to have a left tackle competition is pretty big news that you don't always get at this point of the offseason. But we got that going on. Then at the top of the draft, they're going to be in a spot where the best player available might be Evan Neal or Ike Mekwanu. So those two guys play tackle, but they could play guard. So do you start running them out at guard? Do you start them out at tackle? Trade Mekhi Becton, trade George Fant. There's a lot of different ways they could go with it, but it does feel like a good problem that they have so much talent here. They got 2 first-round picks already. George Fant just had a great season. Connor McGovern had a solid season. And they just have that one spot left to fill, assuming Mekhi Becton is healthy. So it's going to be interesting to see how they approach it in free agency because I think, like I said, once they get to the draft and they come on the clock at 4, Ekwonu or Neal might be the best pick for them in terms of best player available. And, maybe putting one of those guys at guard, specifically Ekwonu, who I think I preferred Evan Neal personally. Maybe that's the route you go. But in terms of the free agent guards, there are a few good players available. Connor Williams, another Cowboy, could pair him up with Schultz. He's a top of the line guard. There are a few others as well. Brandon Scherf, who seems like the 80th year in a row he's a free agent, and we're talking about him. Andrew Norwell, Laken Tomlinson from the Niners. So there's a Michael Floor connection there. So there are some good. Austin Corbett from the Rams. So there are some solid free agent guard names out there. So do they try to plug that hole there, then put off the offensive line in the draft, or do they put it off in free agency, address it in the draft? And then there's LDT in all of this. I think he was solid in the latter half of the season. I think you saw when you replace Greg Van Roten, who was playing atrociously, with LDT, who was, okay to good. I think you saw that was all they really needed to start playing a lot better, getting the 1 weak link out of there. But I think if he is open to it, bringing him back as depth definitely makes sense, or at least the stopgap at right guard prior to the draft, pending any moves there, makes a lot of sense. So there's a lot of different avenues they can go with the offensive line. But at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing is that a lot of these problems are good. They have a lot of talent, a lot of good options. And the most important thing is just figuring out how to put all these pieces together.
I believe the first time Brandon Scherf was a free agent, they were still playing with leather helmets.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a while. I mean, every single year it feels like.
Now, a guy I would love to have back is Morgan Moses, and I'm not sure how viable it is because if you have Becton and Fant both here, you cannot guarantee Morgan Moses a starting job, whereas other teams will be able to do that. I just thought he was really solid this year. I thought you got more from him than you could reasonably expect from any backup tackle. I know I read an article you wrote that maybe his season was a little overrated, but still very solid job he did. Very durable guy. Again, my hopes aren't particularly high, but if they could figure out a way to make it work, I would love to see him back.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think he's definitely, like we talked about earlier with quarterbacks, in terms of backup talent, sometimes you have to keep your expectations in check, but Moses is about as good as you can get in terms of a backup. They signed him. He's supposed to be the backup swing tackle. Week 1, he gets thrown right in there, starts all season, and does a much better job than I think any player in that role should ever be expected to do. The point that I made in my article was I do think he struggled in pass protection. He gave up a lot of pressures. They weren't always catastrophic. He didn't give up the biggest sacks and strip sacks or have 100 penalties. So it wasn't the most catastrophic damage, but he did get beat pretty often. So his pass protection wasn't great, but I think his run blocking was really good. So, and that's a lot more than you could expect from any backup tackle. So if they could get him back, then it would be a huge win. But like you said, I think he's definitely capable of getting starting job somewhere else. He's better than a lot of the tackles that started for teams this past season. So I think they'd be lucky to get him back as a backup, but it's something they should look to do. And then if he doesn't come back, it's another hole they got to fill. Who is that backup tackle?
Well, that's all for our show today. Thank you for listening and thank you for watching. And don't worry, Michael's going to be back tomorrow. If you were worried that we were only talking about offense, Michael and I will pick up the discussion on Friday to talk about free agent defensive players who could help the Jets improve what is one of the worst defenses in football. But for today, this has been the Locked On Jets podcast. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Again, our motto is your team every day. We produce new episodes each day, Monday through Friday. If you like what you see or hear, click the subscribe button. And if you're on YouTube and like this episode, give it a thumbs up. It'll help other Jets fans find the channel. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week and talk more Jets.